day, pretty much, okay? And this will be on next week's test. Most of this stuff will. So, okay. In the 1950s, okay, Brown versus Board. You guys know what that is, okay? This is going to overturn Plessy when it comes to public schools. In other words, the concept of separate but equal does not apply to education, public education. Thurgood Marshall is the NAACP attorney who filed the class action suit. He will later on become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Does everybody know what a class action lawsuit is? A class action suit is one that one person files on behalf of a lot of people. Okay? Linda Brown was not the only black kid in America not being able to go to a new school because you went to a black school. Okay? But somebody has to file the lawsuit. So Brown versus Board is a class action lawsuit. Okay? You see these commercials on television all the time about if you've been infected with asbestos or something like that, file a lawsuit. That's a class action suit. They're trying to find out anybody who wants to join the suit who may have had this problem. Okay. You know about Rosa Parks, and guys, this is all pretty elementary stuff. Okay. The Montgomery bus boycott.
William DeLeon, you're right in the front. William DeLeon, you're right in the front.
The Montgomery bus boycott is important. Here's why, okay? Think all the way back to the American Revolution, before the American Revolution. And we talked about the Stamp Act. And we talked about how the colonists came up with the Stacked Act Congress, a formal protest. Didn't work. They had violent protests, the Sons of Liberty. Didn't work. The only thing that worked in getting the Crown's attention was a non-importation agreement, a boycott. Okay, that's important. And what that showed people then on, if you want to sit here and make a statement in America, hit them where it hurts the most, hit them in the pocketbook. That has been a staple of American history. You guys are reading right now about a man named Cesar Chavez in United Farm Workers. That's how he was able to achieve his goals, through boycott, okay? The same thing here. When they boycotted the Montgomery bus system, African Americans are the ones who used the Montgomery bus system. So when you boycott the system, there goes their business. There goes their demand, okay? So again, please don't ever underestimate the effect of a boycott. Because the reason is, you're playing an American game by America's rules. It's all about money. Dr. King knew that. That's why they did that, okay? So always keep in mind what they're doing here. They could have taken to the streets and walked up and down and protested and stuff like that. They could have rioted. It would not have done a bit of good. That did because somebody's not making money. Because everybody understand what's going on here. That's a big deal, okay? All right. We talked about this today. Okay, Dr. King is going to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, this is the first big organization that is actually going to take physical action. They will protest and things like this. It's not quite as widespread as the NAACP, but this all arises out of Rosa Parks' issue. This is a couple of weeks ago. This was in your reading. Okay. The federal government said that Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas had to be integrated, and the governor of the state, Orville Faubus, said no, and I'm going to call out my National Guard to prevent these black kids from coming in my school. Okay? That is a violation of federal law, and what he's doing is, guys, he's standing up to Brown versus Board. A lot of these things, we saw George Wallace today, okay, standing in the doorway. A lot of these things are reactions to the federal government forcing integration. Okay? Guys, people in the South believe in segregation. Okay? And they don't want the federal government shoving desegregation down their throat. So when these kids try to go to school, Dwight Eisenhower had to send the 101st Airborne to escort them in. Okay? So what this is showing you is this, it's almost like black people are pawns. Okay? You've got this argument between the states and the national government over who has the right to decide who goes to a public school. Okay? Black people are caught in the middle. So when you write about these things, always remember this, especially about Brown versus Board. It is a racial issue, okay? But it's also a states' rights issue. Both of these things have play here because the states can stand back and say, you don't have the right to do that. I'm invoking my 10th Amendment rights, okay? This is why a lot of southern states like Virginia shut down their school systems for 5 years. They'd rather homeschool their kids than to send them to a school with a black person, okay? So never, when you talk about this stuff right here, never forget the aspect of states' rights, okay? This is the Civil Rights Act of 57. Don't pretty much worry about this one. This is one that came under Eisenhower. I think we wrote about it in the reading. All it's going to do is to create a commission to investigate. Didn't really accomplish a lot. Didn't accomplish a lot. Because guys, if you are a commissioner working for the federal government and you go into southern Mississippi to a school district, are you going to get any cooperation? They didn't. So this is something that Eisenhower tried to do. It didn't really work, okay, but the effort was there, all right? The 60s. Overview of the 1950s and race relations, it was pretty active, okay? It was pretty active because it was caused by the actions of people like Dr. King and people like that, okay? Okay, this is SNCC. We talked about them today, okay? They're the ones that orchestrated the sit-in at the Greensboro lunch counter. Guys, the sit-ins and things are pretty important. It's nonviolent protest. If you walked into, guys, in those days, places like, oh gosh, we don't even have them anymore. Woolworths, okay? There were department stores, but they had a luncheon counter in the back. You could go back there and I remember years ago, Sears used to have it. You know, you could go in and sit down and get a malt or something while you were shopping, okay? Well, these kids went into a store in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they went back there, sat down, and ordered food, okay? The problem is they didn't allow blacks, okay? So they sat there anyway. They didn't get any food, but people that were eating around them were dumping malts on their heads and throwing food and stuff at them like this. This is nonviolent protest. They would not leave until the sheriff's department came and forcibly removed them, okay? We talked about something today in class. It's very important. When you think about nonviolent protest, what makes it work? Television. Don't ever forget that. That makes it work. If you sit here and say, hey guys, I just heard the other day about a bunch of black kids who went to a lunch counter and they wouldn't leave and people were throwing stuff at them and the cops drug them off. Yeah. That's just one thing. When you see it on television, it makes a greater impact. The greatest ally of the civil rights movement will be television. Okay? Most of the things they do, pretty much everything Martin Luther King does, is orchestrated for television. Because the camera doesn't lie. When you look on television and you see Bull O'Connor with the water hoses and the attack dogs, okay, that's not just a rumor. That's the truth. So guys, these people were brilliant. They were smart enough to realize what they could do. They were smart to realize they could reach into America's living rooms every night and push that button. They could push that button with outrage. Americans are people who want to see justice, okay? And when you see these kids getting assaulted like that at a lunch counter just because they're sitting there, that's not justice, okay? So television is going to be the great equalizer for the civil rights movement, okay? This is Core and the Freedom Riders. Remember what the Freedom Riders were trying to do? They were trying to bring attention to the fact that some southern states were openly violating federal law, okay, by segregating bus stops. It's really weird because if you say you slid into Memphis, Tennessee, all right, and you're black and you get off the bus and you go into the bus terminal, okay, and they say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed in here. Well, federal law says you are allowed in there, but Jim Crow says you're not, okay? And that's what the problem was. Guys, one of these two laws has to be subservient to the other. And the Constitution, Supremacy Clause says that federal law is subservient. These southern states said no, Jim Crow is. Okay? So that's what the Freedom Riders are all about. They wanted to show America that southern states were flagrantly violating federal law by desegregating bus stops. Okay? Then Dr. King is going to march on Washington. Here's why this is important. Okay? Again, this is television. If you live in some corner of Iowa somewhere, okay, and you hear about this stuff, this is so far removed from anything you've ever seen in your life. You may have never seen a black person before. if you're on a farm somewhere in Iowa, Nebraska, somewhere like that, and you hear about stuff like the Freedom Riders, but it doesn't really register. It's just one more group of people pissed off about something that we're not going to pay much attention to. The reason this march is important is it revealed how widespread the support was. A lot of people did not realize how many people backed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the NAACP. When they saw the pictures, like you saw the slide today, of those thousands and thousands and thousands of people crowding the mall just to hear Dr. Martin Luther King give that wonderful speech. Okay, when I saw that, it revealed that this is not just a bunch of kids playing around. This is a serious issue. Nobody in mainstream America, no member of what Nixon called the silent majority, realized how big it was until they saw this on television. And then they heard Dr. King speak. Okay, and they were mesmerized by this. And a lot of people, I remember reading, one guy said, I couldn't understand what he said was pretty much common sense. It should not have been an anomaly. It should not be something special. It should be just taken with a grain of salt. But the fact that he had to say that, and the fact that he said it in front of so many people, is what registered with a lot of middle Americans who had no idea what the civil rights movement was about. That's why it's such a big deal. Okay? Civil Rights Act of 64, guys, that should be the Voting Rights Act of 65. Okay. Part of the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson. Basically speaking, in the Civil Rights Act, on your test last week, basically speaking, the Civil Rights Act says no more segregation in public facilities. If it is a public building, everybody can drink from the same water fountain. Everybody can go to the same bathroom. You cannot segregate public facilities. Okay? The Voting Rights Act is one we probably need to talk about a little bit. Remember when we talked today about the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and one of their goals was to go in and restore participatory democracy? What they were talking about was the fact that in the South, there were barriers to black people voting. Some had been there since Reconstruction. Okay? There was a literacy test. In other words, if you got ready to vote, you had to prove you could read or write. So Joe Bob Sharecropper goes up there, this white guy goes up there, and they say, okay, read this. Dog jumped over the fence. Okay, sign your name. And he put an X because he's pretty liberal. Well, he's good to go. He can vote. Then the black guy comes up. And they give them the penal code for the state of Mississippi, which no lawyer can understand, much less the black guy. And then when he signs his name, makes an X, that's not good enough, okay? So these things were rigged to keep voting. These were black codes, okay? Poll taxes. You had to pay a tax to vote. If you did not pay a tax, you could not vote. And this weighed in on the fact that most blacks were sharecroppers. They had no money, okay? The Voting Rights Act of 65 eliminates these. That's important. The Voting Rights Act eliminates all these barriers to voting. And it took a long time for this to go into effect. In 1976, in Rayville, Louisiana, they were still collecting poll taxes until they got caught. My favorite one of these is one called the Grandfather Clause. Okay? And this goes back to Reconstruction. The Grandfather Clause said that, okay, you've got your 15th Amendment, you can vote, but here in the state of Mississippi, by God, we've got other requirements. And the requirement is this: you can't vote unless a member of your family was registered to vote in 1860. 1860 is before the war, okay? No African American in the United States is going to have a relative eligible to vote in 1860. So what they're saying is this: oops, you mean you don't have a father, mother, brother, anyone that's registered to vote in 1860? You can't vote. Okay? And that was one way of preventing African Americans from voting. It got ingenious after a while. These are all black codes. Okay? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act will get rid of all that. Okay, everybody get support. Big E. Okay? I think it's about as far as we got in the first period today. Dr. King was showing support for the Voting Rights Act when they went to Selma. Okay? And Selma, Alabama is a small town. There's a bridge over a river. that you walk from one side of the bridge to the other side. It's called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And what they were going to do is have a group of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And guys, if you look at those pictures, there are no young people there. These are all middle-aged people. Okay? And they had their Sunday best on, and they marched over the bridge, showing their support for the Voting Rights Act. When they got to the other side and everything, that's when the dogs hit them. Okay? They were attacked by dogs, attacked by policemen, because they were accused of inciting a riot, which is ridiculous. Okay? And again, all on television. Okay? The reason this is important is this is going to radicalize the civil rights movement. Okay? Members of SNCC who see this say, that's it. That's it. This man is the founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He's preached nonviolent protest, and he walks off this bridge. He's getting beat to death with a policeman with a billy club. How much more do we have to take? So the events at Selma is what's going to radicalize SNCC. Okay? Is everybody good so far? Okay. This is when it fractures. Okay? If you're in first period, we looked at some of these names. The rest of you guys haven't seen them yet. Okay? Bobby Seale and Huey Newton will form a group called the Black Panthers. They are a radical group. They used to belong to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they're convinced that Booker T. Washington's way of accommodation is not going to work. So they're going to try Du Bois' way. Okay? They are going to be very much against peaceful protest. They'll be a socio-political, almost a paramilitary organization. The Black Panthers, as founded in 1965, were considered by the U.S. government to be a terrorist organization. Okay? Now, they're still here today. There's a huge chapter in Houston. Okay? They're not a terrorist organization, but if you ever see them on television, you'll be able to recognize them. They have black military fatigues, they wear a black beret, and they're usually carrying guns. Okay? So they are still around today. They carry guns because this is Texas. We got open carry. Okay? So the Black Panthers is going to be the first really militant civil rights organization. They are going to take some of their influence from the Weathermen. Okay? Okay. Then you have this, and this is important. A man named Elijah Muhammad is going to form a group called the Nation of Islam. They will be called the Black Muslims. They are also still around today, and they're also very prevalent in Houston. These are African Americans who've embraced Islam. Okay, embraced Islam. And Muhammad is telling them that the Nation of Islam is separate than other civil rights organizations. Okay? They don't as much preach violence as they preach separatism. They want black Muslims to come together and separate, okay? They want people to accept their religion and change their identity. The most famous person was a man named Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay was the heavyweight champion of the world. And he accepted black Muslims and became Muhammad Ali, okay? A man named Lew Alcindor was a basketball player who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, okay? These are all members of the black Muslims who changed their name, okay? Bobby Lewis was a wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills and changed his name to Ahmad Rashad. So these are people that adopted black nationalism and the black Muslims. The most famous was Malcolm X. Okay? Malcolm Little refused to change his name to Islam because he didn't consider himself a Muslim. Okay? But he did not want to use the name Little. He said, that's my slave name. That's the name the masters gave my parents. So because I really have no identity, I'll just refer to myself as X. Okay? We're going to talk about this in class a little bit, okay? Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam and became so popular with people because he appealed to young people. He threatened Elijah Muhammad, who had him assassinated in 1965. Malcolm X was assassinated by his own people, okay? And again, this is something else we'll talk about in class a little bit. Okay. Because of Selma, because of the outrage over Selma, because of the outrage over the assassination of Malcolm X, who every black person thought was organized by the FBI, okay? You start to see violence break out through America. From 1965 to 1969, 4 years, racial violence lit up the United States. It was in Detroit. It was in Watts and Los Angeles. All over the country, you had racial riots erupting. They all erupted in these old, run-down urban areas that had been decaying. Okay? So when Americans saw television cameras and they saw the race riots, they saw where they lived. They saw the effects of urban decay and white flight, which did pretty much nothing more than make them feel sorry for them, pretty much. Okay? So what happens is these radical African-American activists like the Black Panthers have had enough. That's it. Okay? This is when Malcolm X, about before he got assassinated, said that famous quote, "by any means necessary." We're going to get equality. We're going to get respect by any means necessary, which includes violence. And that's what happened when the Danger raids exploded. Okay? We don't really have anything today that we can look at in your lifetime that rivals this. I remember watching television. It looked like a war zone. You had whole cities that were on fire. You saw tanks running down the middle of the city, especially in Detroit. You saw Liberty City in Miami. You could stand at the top of the Orange Bowl in Miami, look out and see the whole landscape on fire. Okay? This is just anger. It's frustration. And it all boils over. It's fueled by poverty. It's fueled by urban decay. And by 1965, after they saw those people getting beat up at Selma, after Malcolm X got assassinated, it just boiled over. Okay, so the days of rage is racial violence in America. Okay. Then this happened. More days of rage. Okay. Dr. King was in Memphis, Tennessee. He walked out into the balcony of a hotel. If you go to Memphis today, the hotel where he got assassinated is a museum now. He walked out onto the balcony and he was shot from across the street. Okay? So he was assassinated in 1968. 1968 was a bad year. We're going to talk about this later. It was probably one of the worst years in American history. It started out with the Tet Offensive. That's how it started. In March, you got Lyndon Johnson saying, "I'm not running for re-election." Then in the summertime, you had the battle for Chicago, the Democratic National Convention. You had Martin Luther King get assassinated. Then you had Bobby Kennedy get assassinated. All in 1968. So 68 is a pivotal year in the 1960s because a lot of bad stuff happened.